Ah yes, 102 Dalmatians. The Oscar nominee? Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about Disney's 2000 live-action remake sequel, 102 Dalmatians. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. 102 Dalmatians stars Glenn Close, Ioan Gruffudd, and Alice Evans, and was directed by Kevin Lima. Set 3 years after the events of the 1996 live-action remake of 101 Dalmatians, it tells the story of the recently released Cruella de Vil, who has supposedly been behaviorally rehabilitated. 102 Dalmatians was the third Disney live-action remake and the first sequel within the category. At first glance, and second and third glance too, that might seem a little concerning. Since it isn't based on an animated sequel, it could certainly be viewed as an opportunistic cash grab trying to capitalize on the success of the 1996 remake. And to a large extent, that's exactly what this movie is. But by not being a true remake or adaptation of an existing animated film, but rather a follow-up to one, there was a lot more freedom with the story, which was both a good thing and a bad thing. As a kid, I was a pretty big fan of the 101 Dalmatians remake. I was only 6 years old when it came out, and watched it just as frequently as the animated original growing up. So when the sequel came out, I was still a kid, 10 years old, and went to see it in the theater as well. But even back then, I was not very impressed. Before this rewatch, it had been probably close to 20 years since I last saw this movie, and I remember disliking it. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised by how okay this was. It gets a little tedious by the end, but I enjoyed the first half far more than I remembered. This movie may not have had an animated film to directly adapt, but it did have a predecessor to follow up. And much like the animated DTV sequels of the early 2000s, this film's story only has minimal connections to that of the first. The big one is Glenn Close's Cruella, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Just like the first, the dogs don't talk, though a bird does, and this story is set in the same world as the first. So everybody knows what Cruella did, but those are really the only connections between the two movies. It's not like we're following up with Roger and Anita's story here. We're not going back to the Dalmatian plantation. We do get to see one of the puppies, Dipstick, as an adult, but it feels more like an Easter egg than anything truly pertinent to the story. And so, it's mostly completely new characters here, with only Cruella and her assistant returning. So, as nice as it would have been to see what Roger and Anita were up to 3 years later, if you were gonna have anybody come back for the sequel, Cruella's who you wanted. And once again, Glenn Close goes all in with this role. There's certainly plenty of crazy, maniacal, evil, campy Cruella here, but there's actually a lot more range to the character this time around, because of the story. It's one of those ridiculous, goofy storylines, but basically, Cruella is behaviorally conditioned, humorously, by Dr. Pavlov, and cured of her puppy and fur obsession. Of course, I'm sure just about anybody can guess how the story eventually plays out, but we do get to see this weird other side to Cruella. Rewatching this film, especially after having just rewatched the first movie, I was a bit surprised by the tone here. It really goes for this goofy, over-the-top campy vibe. And I gotta say, for the first half or so, I thought it was surprisingly fun. The 1996 film had elements of all that, but the main storyline felt semi-serious, which kind of counterbalanced it. This sequel, on the other hand, just has so many weirdly absurd things that I can't help but feel like the filmmakers were kind of poking fun at their own movie by seeing just how many over-the-top strange things they could add. It gets a little too juvenile by the end, but the first half is full of chuckle-inducing absurdity, ranging from a fashion show featuring a leopard head and tail codpiece to a surreal spot-covered hallucination sequence. So this movie does have some amusing elements to it, but it's not a good movie. The whole Cruella storyline is easily the most interesting part of the story, and while it is a big component of the plot, it's not the only component. And that's where this movie really falters. It just has way too many things happening. In addition to the Cruella rehabilitation thing, there are like 10 other subplots going on. There's a love story, a self-conscious spotless Dalmatian puppy, a parrot that thinks it's a dog rescue organization that's at risk of going under, and, of course, a scheme to steal some puppies to make a coat. with a hood this time. It's just this mishmash of way too many half-baked ideas, with only the tired rehash of Cruella's classic scheme coming close to being fully baked. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The big pro here, much like with its predecessor, is Glenn Close as Cruella de Vil. Once again, she nails the over-the-top, campy wildness of this character. Whereas the first film had her feeling a bit more evil, this one adds a little range to the character, and it's extremely clear that Glenn Close had a lot of fun with this role. It's so ridiculous at times, but it works. Plus, we get a little bit more of the fashion designer side of Cruella here, and she's got some wild costumes, which is how this movie nabbed that Oscar nomination I mentioned before. On the con side, the biggest issue is the third act. This movie's bogged down by way too many subplots, and definitely feels all over the place throughout, but it manages to stay strangely entertaining in its absurdity for the first half. Unfortunately, things really start to go downhill towards the end of the second act, and by the time we hit the third act, it's just this boring rehash of the same puppy rescue plot we've seen in literally every movie of the franchise up to this point, with the added detriment of cheesy early 2000s family comedy and CGI. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying 102 Dalmatians or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give 102 Dalmatians 2.5 out of 5 paws. To be honest, I expected this to be much lower going in. The third act certainly didn't help it any, but I was surprised by just how bizarrely enjoyable nearly all of the Cruella stuff in the first half was. I would recommend 102 Dalmatians, mostly to big fans of the 1996 101 Dalmatians remake, because if you really like that one, it means one of two things. You really liked the over-the-top campiness of Glenn Close's Cruella, or you grew up with the movie and have some nostalgia for it. In either case, those same things will probably apply here. I doubt anybody's gonna like this one more, but it has its moments. If you liked 102 Dalmatians, I would obviously recommend the 1996 remake of 101 Dalmatians. That film actually had an existing animated story to adapt, so it's a bit more cohesive, plus it served as the introduction for Glenn Close's iteration of Cruella de Vil. If you like the slapstick elements of the villain scheme, you should check out Home Alone for some more "how was that not fatal" moments. And if you just want some more Dalmatians, obviously I'd be remiss not to suggest the original animated 101 Dalmatians. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen 102 Dalmatians? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite dog-centric sequel? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.